They feel with this new trade in people, they've been taken for a ride. And if the government doesn't fix it, the government won't last. Way back in the 2000s, 2003, my local city, Hull, had really serious community tension. I think there was even a murder, as a result of Eastern Europeans coming into Hull, and that being exploited by extremists, and that's what's happened over the years. So I think it's a really serious consideration. It's one of the things, about half a dozen things, but it's one of the things the Home Office ought to take into account before it sends anybody anywhere. And truth be told, at the moment, I don't think it does it at all.
Yeah, and a lot of the communities where people are being sent, almost by the nature of the fact that we're looking for hotels, in some cases looking for cheap hotels, are areas where there is deprivation, where there are already a lot of social problems, a lot of contact with agencies, for example. That's surely just storing up problems for the future.
Oh, it is. Oh, it's not very far in the future. Most of these locations, actually, to be honest, most urban locations in Britain, apart from some very wealthy areas, have got public sector, public service problems at the moment with healthcare delivery, social care delivery, and so on. And all of this piles on top of that. It puts an extra demand on top of that. We've got, in my part of the world, for example, we've got a lot of people arriving as adults, actually then turns out they're actually children. They're actually less than the age majority, and suddenly they've got a whole new series of demands. So right across the board, from that through to the effect of the Albanian gangs who bring them, who very often say, well, you don't have to pay your 5,000 now. You can do work for us in criminal pursuits when you get there. So you end up in drugs and prostitution and so on. So there's a whole range of social problems, and the Home Office really ought to focus on avoiding those wherever it places people.
But the people are here,
yeah,
and they're arriving.
Yeah.
What can be done?
Well, the first answer, Adam, is you've got to actually stop the flow, because as it stands, there is no way of coping with 30,000, 40,000 people every year at this rate. And as you've already seen, Manston's now overwhelmed, and they're having trouble even getting the would-be asylum seekers into ex-RAF camps. So there is no answer unless you stop the flow. Or at least, stop is the wrong word, because you're never going to stop all asylum seekers coming, because there are a lot of legitimate ones, but stop the ones that don't really have a claim.
So what is your answer to that? Because obviously there are humanitarian concerns as well. We're not going to let people drown.
Exactly. If somebody's an Afghan asylum seeker who's perhaps worked for the British government and is now under threat from Taliban, we have no choice morally. We have to take them on board.
See, 55% of people are actually being approved as asylum seekers once they're processed, but obviously it takes a long time.
But that's after 2-3 years generally. There are a significant number of asylum seekers, particularly from, I'm talking about a third. When I say let's get the numbers about right. About 12,000 so far this year, who come from Albania, which is a safe country. And there is no real claim for somebody coming from Albania to claim asylum here. Some are given asylum.
Well, the government approves around 50% of asylum claims from Albanians. What
it does, if you look at the Albanian one, it's quite interesting, because the young men, there's a very large number of young men, they get about 15% get approved. I think, truthfully, all of them are wrongly. But then you've got, amongst women and children, you've got 85% approval. Now, they're not really being given what you would think of as conventional asylum. Asylum is to protect you from an oppressive state. What's happening with these is they're really being given an approval on the basis of local crime and gangsters, and that's not what asylum's for.
But you can understand why people would make that journey. You look at the odds. If you're a woman and you make that trip, you come to the UK, you look at the odds and you think, well, around 50% of people get approved. I'm going to try my luck. You can understand why people would do that.
Of course. And if you look at the numbers, we have a 55%. I issued these numbers last week. We have a 55% approval rate. The next highest in Europe is Italy, which actually can't control its borders at all, but it still has it 19%. And then it's France, which is, I think, between 2 and 6%, depending on how you measure it. So, of course, they're going to come here, because we're the people who say yes.
But then it doesn't make sense with what the Home Secretary is saying, because she's saying, well, I blame these people who make this dangerous journey and it's all their fault. But actually, the UK government is sending a signal to people that if you come out here, you'll succeed.
That is exactly correct. And what's happening is, I don't blame the individual to do it. Look, if you live in a very poor country and you're going to try and take every opportunity, what I do blame the Albanian gangs, But what's happening here, I talked to the National Crime Agency about the Albanian gangs, and their word was an interesting word. They said they're the most efficient gangs in the world. I said, what do you mean efficient? It's not a word I've heard applied to criminals before. And they said, well, when they say they're going to do something, they do it. So the other criminals avoid them. That's why they've taken over the drugs trade. And what they spotted here was an economic opportunity. Every one of these people is £5,000 basically, and if we're the people who are going to take it, they'll use our generosity. If you like.
Well, I mean, you're talking about gangsters, and although you say Albania is a safe country, I think it's not yet a full member of the European Union. There are issues in Albania. So, are you saying it would be perfectly within the purview of the government to say, right, anyone from Albania, we're not accepting you, straight on the next plane home? And could we do that legally?
We have to modify some laws. I mean, other countries have done it. Sweden's already done it. I mean, Sweden, about 18 months ago, started doing it on the basis of laws they'd drawn up from European Court of Justice, not European Court of Human Rights, but European Court of Justice.
Which is the EU court.
It's the EU court, but it does much the same thing as the ECHR, but with more power, in effect. And they used ECJ case law.
So within the EU they could do it,
within the EU and within anywhere in the ECHR could do it, could use the same things. And they used that case law, and they dropped their approval rate to zero. Absolutely to zero. Now, Sweden is not a barbaric country. Sweden is not an uncivilized country. It just recognised, earlier than we did, sadly, it just recognised it could not cope with the consequence of having an open border.
Do you have confidence in the Home Secretary?
Well, I don't think the primary problem here is the Home Secretary. I think the primary problem is the legal system and the way we've interpreted it. Take that issue of asylum. That isn't how the asylum law was designed, but that's how the Home Office has interpreted it. Over, I think, 4 Home Secretaries I can think of, and that's the problem. It's not down to an individual. It's down to the system we're using, and it's long overdue we fixed it. I mean, it's not that difficult. I mean, what we're talking in legal terms, it's changing the asylum law to make clear that in a safe country will be turned down. Sweden has a list of 6, I think, and they range from Albania to Mongolia. The safe country will be turned down, and we do the same for people trafficking. So if somebody arrives and says, I've come here and I didn't want to come, I was forced to come, then we say, fine, we send you back home, we give you a free phone number if you want to pursue anything further, but we get you back home first. We don't wait 540 days in Britain while you're in a terrible camp or a place where you might catch a disease or in a rundown hotel. We take you back home and then sort the problem.
Do you think that the government should look at existing legislation? Because we have a gold standard when it comes to modern slavery laws in this country. Theresa May brought those in. She's very proud of them. But some people say that those allow people who come to this country in an illegal way to claim asylum here much more easily than they might without that law.
Yeah, well, that's correct. I mean, Theresa, when she went down that route, she had the best of intentions. And there is a real issue here. She had the best of intentions, but it was written to be riddled with loopholes.
So should it be repealed?
Yeah, no, it doesn't need to be repealed, but it does need to be modified to take out some of the loopholes, like where those people wait while they're awaiting judicial review. That's what the Albanian gang spotted. When somebody gets put on an inflatable on the other side of the channel, they're given a script to work to when they're picked up by the British authorities. And that script involves exploiting loopholes or weaknesses in both our asylum law and our modern slavery people trafficking laws, and we need to correct that. And the simplest way to correct is to say, we'll take you back home and then we'll continue with the case from there.
So the numbers we're seeing now is a direct result, in part, because of the legislation Theresa May introduced.
I think there's no doubt that the loopholes in the law have exacerbated this, and there's no doubt that that's what's created the opportunity for Albanian gangs, and they are exploiting the most open country in Europe, which happens to be us.
Do you think this is consistent with continuing to belong to the European Convention on Human Rights?
Yes, I do. And that's why I picked the Swedish example, you see, because the ECJ, if anything, is tighter than the ECHR, right? But they're basically...
No, I mean, the reason I ask is because they're clearly people who would agree with you about the lists, who also see this in a kind of Brexity way of let's get out of the ECR, get out of Europe, and all that. We had that report this week.
I know, and
from
half
the
of it was
CPS.
right and half of it was wrong. Bluntly, I'm a Brexiteer, but I would never leave the ECHR. I mean, look, the sort of people who leave the ECHR are people like Belarus. And it would be a very bad, well, I almost said stain on our international character, certainly stain on our reputation if we left ECHR. You don't need to. That's the point. You need to have, I mean, if you look around Europe, all the countries that ECHR members, ranging from Italy, 19%, but most of them have zero approval rates for Albanians coming in. And I haven't looked at the other safe countries, but they have zero approval rates for Albanians. I looked at that because that's the biggest number for us. And so you don't need to leave. I mean, I wouldn't anyway, but you don't need to leave. What you need to do is operate it properly. And a lot of people, including, I'm afraid, in the Home Office, find this as an easy thing to blame rather than actually doing the homework and getting it right.
Two quick ones before we let you go. This issue is tearing your party apart. Lee Anderson is one of the latest MPs to warn that he would, well, it sounds to me like he's saying he would find it very difficult to stand as a Tory MP at the next election unless this problem is sorted. Are you worried about that?
Well, I wrote to the Prime Minister 2 weeks ago now. I had 50 colleagues sign my letter. Now it's over 100. I mean, they keep signing it even though it's already gone. Basically, it was partly designed, mostly it was designed to do the job, but the recommendations I've been talking to you about basically unify my entire party, from left to right, from north to south. And if the government does that, and I think it will, what I suspect will happen is around about Christmas, say, we've got this great idea, happens to be declaring Albania a safe country. And I think if they do that, it won't solve the whole problem, but it'll take 1/3 of it out, and it means the rest becomes manageable.
And if they don't do that?
If they don't do that, it'll fail. I mean, bluntly, we'll get punished at the polls. I mean, it won't matter whether Lee stands as a Tory or anything else. He won't get elected. None of us will. I mean, I'm afraid it's really, really... I mean, for a very long time, you've had a sort of paradox in Britain. And the paradox is this. Britain is an incredibly generous country. You saw that with the Ukrainians, right? People would open their arms to them. You see it with Afghans who've been working. You see all, but at the same time, they don't like being taken for a ride. And they feel with this new trade in people, they've been taken for a ride. And if the government doesn't fix it, the government won't last.
Final one. Will you be standing at the next election?
Oh, yeah.
You may not win your seat there on those terms.
Well, the first thing is to have policies that allow any of us to win. But yes, of course, I'll be standing next time. But, I'm not slowing down yet.
David Davis, thank you for joining us on Sunday morning.